I was in the cow barn when the state car rolled into my yard. September 1982, afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the gravel drive. The man who stepped out wore a tie and carried a manila envelope that caught the light like old brass. He looked around, spotted me by the fence post, and his face shifted surprise, maybe disappointment. He walked over slow, like a man approaching something he hadn't expected to find. His hand went up in a half-wave. "Ma'am, is your husband home?" The words landed like they always did, a small punch to the sternum. "My husband passed last year. I'm Rebecca Anderson. This is my farm." He blinked twice, adjusted his grip on the envelope. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm with the Indiana Department of Transportation. We're acquiring right-of-way for the Route 40 expansion." He held out the envelope. "This is our offer for 20 acres of your highway frontage." I took it. The paper felt expensive government weight. Inside a check for $12,000 and a letter explaining that the state was widening U.S. Route 40 from 2 lanes to 4 through Hendricks County. They needed a 200-foot-deep strip running the full half-mile of my frontage for expanded shoulders, drainage easements, and a future interchange planned for the intersection with County Road 200 South. 20 acres total. $12,000, $600 per acre. I looked up from the letter. Farmland selling at $1,800 an acre. The appraisal accounts for proximity to highway infrastructure. Limited agricultural use going forward. Limited agricultural use. I folded the letter back into the envelope. Because you're building the highway that makes it limited. "Ma'am, if you decline, the department will initiate eminent domain proceedings. The appraisal stands either way. This is the fair market value as determined by state assessors." I held the envelope against my chest, felt my heart beating against it. 48 years old, widowed 14 months. 2 children who thought I should sell the whole place and move to Indianapolis, a town that whispered I wouldn't make it through another winter. And now the state offering me a third of what the land was worth because they could. "I'll need time to consider." "Of course. 30 days. Contact information's in the packet." He tipped his head, a gesture somewhere between respect and pity, and walked back to his car. I stood there, holding $12,000 I didn't want, watching dust settle in the driveway. William had been dead for 14 months and 3 days. The grief still came in waves, but that afternoon it arrived as a clear, cold voice in my head. His voice, the last thing he'd said to me in the hospital before the morphine took him under for good. "Don't let them take the frontage, Becky. Promise me." I promised. I always kept my promises to William. The memory came whether I wanted it or not. Autumn 1981. The corn nearly ready. William on the farm. All 7:06, working the back 40. I'd been in the house making lunch when I heard the crash metal on metal, then silence that stretched too long. By the time I reached him, the tractor had rolled, pinned him at an angle that made my stomach turn. His leg was crushed, blood pooling in the dirt. He looked up at me with eyes that already knew. 3 days in the hospital. They tried surgery, tried stabilizing him, tried everything medicine could offer a 52-year-old farmer with internal bleeding they couldn't stop. On the 3rd night, the doctor pulled me aside and used words like hours and prepare yourself. I sat beside William's bed, held his hand, and listened to him fight through pain to tell me what mattered. His voice came out rough, each word costing him. "Becky, listen, People are going to tell you that you can't do this alone. They'll say, sell the farm, move to town, live with Laura. Don't listen. William, don't. Let me finish. He squeezed my hand. My father, Robert, taught me something he learned from a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller. This was back in the 30s. Heinrich owned land along the old interurban trolley line. When the highway replaced the trolley gas stations and motor courts wanted to buy his frontage, Heinrich refused. He leased it instead. 30-year ground leases, renewable rent that escalated every 5 years, never sold a square foot. I wiped my eyes, trying to focus on his words instead of the monitors beeping behind his head. When Heinrich died in 1952, his estate still owned the land. The gas stations had built on his property, paid him to occupy it. The land appreciated, the rent increased, and the Muller family owned the golden position forever. My father told me, the man who sells the land gets money once. The man who leases the land gets money forever. William's breathing went shallow. Route 40's being widened. They'll build an interchange right at our frontage. Don't sell it to them at farm prices. Keep it, lease it, build something that lasts. I don't know if I can do this without you. His eyes met mine, still sharp despite the morphine haze. You're stronger than anyone in this county knows. You've been running this place beside me for 25 years. You just haven't gotten credit because you're a woman. He coughed, blood flecking his lips. Prove them wrong. Keep the frontage. Never sell the ground. He died 6 hours later. I sat with him until morning, then walked out of that hospital into a world that expected me to fail. The first few months I learned what widowhood meant in a farming community. It meant men at Henderson's implement asking if I had someone to help me work on the tractor, their voices dripping with concern that felt more like condescension. It meant the feed store manager suggesting I hire a farmhand, maybe someone to oversee things, since a woman alone couldn't manage 240 acres. It meant James Thompson from First National Bank calling me in for a meeting about the future of my operation. His smile too wide, his eyes calculating numbers I couldn't see. I learned to ignore the concern. I learned to fix what broke, hire help when I needed it, and keep my mouth shut when men assumed I didn't understand crop rotation or commodity prices. I learned to cash William's life insurance check and put it in savings without touching a dollar because I knew that someday I'd need every penny. Now I stood in my kitchen, that envelope on the table, looking at $12,000. That represented everything William had warned me about. The state wanted to buy my frontage at agricultural prices and create commercial value with taxpayer-funded infrastructure. The interchange they'd build would make the adjacent land worth 10, 15, maybe 20 times what they were offering, and I'd be the woman who sold it for $600 an acre. I called Laura first. She was teaching 3rd grade in Carmel, married to a decent man who worked in insurance, living a neat suburban life that felt 1,000 miles from the farm, even though it was only 40 minutes up the road. Her voice came bright and clear through the phone line. Mom, is everything okay? The state made an offer on the frontage, $12,000 for 20 acres. Silence, then a careful breath. That's a lot of money, Mom. It's 1/3 of market value. But it's still $12,000. You could pay off David's tuition, fix the roof on the barn, maybe even trade in the old farmall for something that doesn't break down every harvest. She paused, and I heard what she wasn't saying. You could stop working yourself to death. Your father told me not to sell the frontage. Dad's gone, Mom. Her voice went soft the way it did when she thought I was clinging to the past. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You could take this money and breathe a little easier. I looked out the window at the half-mile strip that ran along Route 40. The same strip that had been part of the original homestead claim in 1853. Every generation had farmed it, fenced it, considered it the most valuable section of the property because it touched the road. The frontage is where the value lives, William had said. Never sell it. I'm not taking it. Laura's sigh carried through the phone line like wind through corn. Mom, please think about this. You're alone out there. You work dawn to dark. The town's already talking about how long you can keep this up. If you turn down $12,000 to keep land you can't even develop, I'll call you later. I hung up before she could finish, before her reasonable concerns could burrow under my skin and make me doubt. David came home that weekend from Purdue, where he was studying engineering and dating a girl from Fort Wayne who'd never set foot on a farm. He sat at the kitchen table, the envelope between us, and used his engineering student logic to explain why I should take the money. Mom, $12,000 invested in bonds at 10% annual yield generates $1,200 a year. That's passive income. You wouldn't have to plow or plant or harvest that 20 acres anymore. I looked at my 19-year-old son, so smart, so certain, so completely missing the point. Your father spent his last conscious hours telling me to keep this land. Dad was dying. He was scared. He wanted to make sure you'd be okay. David's voice cracked on the last word. But he's not here now, and you're working yourself into the ground, trying to prove you can do what he did. The anger came fast and hot. I'm not trying to prove I can do what he did. I'm trying to do what he asked me to do. Which is what? Hold on to 20 acres of corn that the state's going to take anyway through eminent domain. He pushed the envelope toward me. They're offering $12,000 now. If you fight them, you'll spend thousands on lawyers just to end up with the same result. I picked up the envelope and walked to the stove, turned on the burner, held the corner of the paper to the flame. It caught fast yellow fire, eating through the state seal. I dropped it in the sink and watched it burn. David stared. Mom, what are you doing? I'm not selling. The smoke alarm started screaming. I waved a dish towel at it until it stopped. The state thinks a widow won't fight. They're wrong. He left before dinner, drove back to Purdue, shaking his head, and I stood in my kitchen alone, breathing smoke and certainty. But first, I needed to know what I was fighting for. 3 days later, I drove to Indianapolis, took I-465 around the east side to where it intersected with I-70. I'd heard about these interchanges, how they'd been built through farmland 10 to 15 years earlier, but I'd never seen them up close. Now I drove slowly past the commercial development that clustered around the cloverleaf ramps, gas stations, fast food restaurants, a Holiday Inn, a shopping plaza. Every building sat on what had been cornfield in 1970. I pulled into a Shell station, filled my tank, and walked inside to pay. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60, gray hair, pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. I handed her a 20. Busy intersection? Been here since 72. Gets busier every year. She made change, counted it back into my palm with practiced efficiency. You own this station? She laughed. Lord, no. My father owns the land. Shell leases it from him, has since 1970. Something in my chest tightened. Your father leases the land. 30-year ground lease. They wanted to buy it outright back then, offered him $50,000 for the whole 5 acres. He said no, told them they could rent it for $8,000 a year with 3% escalation. Thought he was crazy turning down $50,000 cash. She leaned on the counter. That $8,000 a year, it's $20,000 now, and in 2000 when the lease expires, he gets the land back, plus whatever improvements Shell built. Or he renegotiates at current market rates, which will be triple what they're paying now. I must have looked stunned because she smiled. You got land someone wants to buy, the state, for a highway expansion. Her smile faded. Don't sell it. I don't care what they offer. The highway makes the land valuable, and if you sell, you give away the value you'll create. My father taught me that. He said, Sandra, land appreciates, buildings depreciate. Own the thing that appreciates. I drove home with Sandra Clark's words burning in my brain. Her father had turned down $50,000 in 1970 to lease at $8,000 a year. Now that $8,000 was worth $20,000 annually, would hit $60,000 or more when the lease renewed. $50,000 once or $20,000 forever. The math wasn't even close. Route 40 was being widened because traffic was increasing. Traffic was increasing because suburbs were expanding west from Indianapolis. When the highway reached 4 lanes with an interchange at County Road 200 South, right at my frontage, the land wouldn't be worth $600 an acre for corn. It would be worth whatever a gas station, a restaurant, a strip mall, or a hotel developer would pay for highway frontage with direct interchange access. The state was offering me $12,000 for land that would be worth $300,000 or more once they built the infrastructure that made it valuable. And they thought I wouldn't notice because I was a widow in over my head. I called Laura and David back that night, told them both to come home the following weekend. They arrived Sunday afternoon, and I laid out my research at the kitchen table, notes from my trip to Indianapolis, numbers from Sandra Clark calculations based on interchange land values I'd found at the county assessor's office. Laura read through the papers slowly. Mom, you really think the land could be worth this much? I know it will be. The state knows it will be. That's why they're buying it now at farm prices. David picked up the Shell station numbers. This guy turned down $50,000 and made it into ongoing income, forever income, and he still owns the land. They looked at each other, then back at me. Laura spoke first. What do you need from us? Support. When people say I'm making a mistake, I need you to tell them I'm not. When the bank starts circling, I need you to know I have a plan. When this town writes me off as a stubborn widow who doesn't know when to quit, I need my children to know better. David's voice went quiet. What did Dad tell you in the hospital? I told them about Heinrich Müller, about the interurban trolley line, about William's father teaching him that the man who sells gets money once, but the man who leases gets money forever. I told them about William's last words about the promise I'd made. Laura cried. David stared at the table, and when they left that night, they both hugged me harder than they had since the funeral. Monday morning, I called the Indiana Department of Transportation and told them I was declining their offer. The man on the phone went silent for a long moment. Mrs. Anderson, if you refuse, we'll proceed with eminent domain. You understand that? I understand. You'll try to take my land through condemnation at an appraisal that undervalues it by 2/3. I also understand we have the right to challenge that appraisal in court. Another pause. Ma'am, legal proceedings are expensive. So is giving away $300,000 for $12,000. I hung up before he could respond. Then I called every attorney in the phone book until I found Kathleen Wright. She was 38, the only woman practicing land use law within 50 miles, and she'd spent 15 years fighting twice as hard as men for half the recognition. When I explained what I needed, her laugh came sharp and bright. "Rebecca Anderson, I've heard about you." "What have you heard?" "That you're the widow trying to run a 240-acre farm alone. That the town's betting you won't last another year. That you just told the state to shove their $12,000 offer." She paused. "I like you already. I need someone who'll fight, not someone who'll tell me to settle. I charge $150 an hour, same as the men. I don't give widow discounts, and I don't lose cases because judges underestimate me. You want a woman lawyer who plays nice, call someone else. You want a woman lawyer who wins, I'm your person. When can we start? I'll file the response to their eminent domain notice tomorrow. Meet me at my office Friday at 9. Bring every document you have about the property, every piece of correspondence from INDOT, and a check for $2,000 as a retainer." I wrote the check Thursday night, $2,000 from the life insurance money William had left me. I thought about him sitting beside me at this same table, going over the farm accounts, his handwriting neat in the ledger book. He'd always been careful with money, paying cash when he could, financing only when necessary, keeping reserves for bad years. Now I was spending $2,000 to fight the state over land that might take years to prove valuable. But William had known. Somehow he'd known. The meeting with Kathleen lasted 3 hours. She reviewed every deed, every survey, every tax record. She made notes in tight, precise handwriting, asked questions that cut straight to the heart of the state's case. They're claiming limited agricultural use due to proximity to highway infrastructure. That's what the appraisal says, which is circular reasoning. The highway creates the limitation, so they use the limitation to justify a low price. It's legal theft dressed up in condemnation language. She tapped her pen against the desk. "Here's what we're going to do. We'll challenge the amount they're taking and the price they're paying. They want 20 acres for current widening and future interchange. We'll argue they can only take what they need now, which is maybe 8 acres for the road expansion. The interchange is speculative, not funded, not approved, not necessary for current project. They can't condemn land for a project that doesn't exist yet." Hope flickered in my chest. "You think that'll work?" "Indiana law is clear. Eminent domain is for public necessity, not public convenience. They have to prove they need every acre they're taking. If they can't prove the interchange is happening now, they can't take land for it now." She looked up from her notes. "But, Rebecca, this will be a fight. 2 years minimum, probably longer. They'll drag it out, try to exhaust you financially and emotionally. You'll have legal bills in the thousands. The town will call you stubborn. The bank might get nervous. Your kids might beg you to settle. Can you handle that?" I thought about William dying in that hospital bed, thought about Sandra Clark's father turning down $50,000, thought about every man who'd assumed I'd fold because I was a woman alone. "I can handle it." Kathleen smiled. "Then let's make the state regret underestimating a widow." The condemnation proceedings started in January 1983. The state filed their case in Hendricks County Circuit Court, claiming public necessity for the full 20 acres. Kathleen filed our response, challenging both the amount and the appraisal. The judge set a hearing for March. That's when James Thompson called me into First National Bank. He sat behind his desk in a suit that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Fingers, steepled smile fixed. "Mrs. Anderson, thank you for coming in. I wanted to discuss your accounts." "Is there a problem?" "Not yet, but I'm concerned about recent activity. You wrote a large check to an attorney. You're engaged in litigation with the state. These legal fees can add up quickly, and I want to make sure you're financially stable." I kept my voice level. "I have no debt with this bank. My farm is paid for. My equipment is paid for. I'm current on all expenses." Of course, of course." His smile never wavered. "But legal battles are unpredictable. If you find yourself needing an operating loan, which many farmers do in difficult times, we'd require collateral. Given the uncertainty around your highway frontage, that collateral would have to be substantial." The threat landed soft but clear. If I borrowed money, the bank would want control of my land. And in 1983, with interest rates above 18% and corn prices below $2, most farmers needed operating loans to survive. I won't need a loan. Mrs. Anderson, with all due respect, farming is difficult, even for experienced operators. For a woman in your situation, in my situation, the words came out colder than I intended. He blinked, recalculated. "Without a husband, it's simply more challenging. I'm trying to help you plan ahead." I stood up. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Thompson, but I'll manage my own finances." I walked out of that bank, knowing James Thompson was waiting for me to fail, hoping for it, maybe. A widow's farm going under meant opportunity for someone else. A buyer, a developer, the bank itself, foreclosing and reselling at a profit. Every institution in Hendricks County ran on the assumption that women couldn't handle what men built. I was going to prove them wrong or die trying. The hearing came in late March. Kathleen argued our case in front of Judge Morrison, a 65-year-old farmer's son who'd worked his way through law school and didn't suffer fools. She laid out the state's overreach, the speculative nature of the interchange, the circular reasoning of the appraisal. The state's attorney pushed back hard. "Your Honor, the interchange has been discussed in transportation planning documents since 1979. It's a matter of when, not if." Kathleen didn't blink. "Discussed isn't approved. Planned isn't funded. The state can't take private property for theoretical future projects. If and when the interchange is approved and funded, they can come back and make a proper offer. Until then, they're limited to what they actually need for the current road expansion." Judge Morrison took 3 weeks to decide. When the ruling came down in April 1984, it split the difference. The state could take 8 acres for immediate highway needs at fair market value of $1,800 per acre, $14,400 total. The remaining 12 acres stayed mine, and Kathleen called me with the news. "Rebecca, you won. Not everything, but enough. They tried to take 20 acres for $12,000. You're keeping 12 acres, and they're paying market rate for the 8 they get. That's a victory." I did the math in my head. $14,400 minus $8,000 in legal fees minus the original $12,000 they'd offered. I'd spent 22 months fighting for a net gain of $2,400 while keeping land I couldn't prove was valuable yet. Laura called that night. "Mom, I don't understand. You spent $8,000 to make an extra $2,400. I spent $8,000 to keep 12 acres that sit exactly where the interchange will be built. When that happens, those 12 acres will be worth more than the whole farm. If it happens, the judge said the interchange isn't approved yet. It will be. The state doesn't put interchanges in planning documents for fun. I could hear her frustration through the phone line, the same frustration I'd heard from everyone in town who thought I'd wasted time and money on stubborn pride. But I also heard something else, a note of uncertainty, like maybe she was starting to wonder if I saw something they didn't. Timothy Henderson, who owned Henderson's Implement and sold farm equipment to every operation in the county, made sure the whole town knew about my victory. I heard the story third hand from my neighbor, Ronald Martinez, who stopped by in early May to return a borrowed fence stretcher. Rebecca, I gotta ask, you really spent $8,000 on a lawyer to fight over 12 acres? I did. Timothy's telling everyone at the diner you're gonna plant corn on that frontage strip, 12 acres, wedged between a 4-lane highway and the rest of your farmland you can't develop because it's zoned agricultural. Says you paid $8,000 for the right to farm corn nobody wants on land you can't use. I looked at Ronald, a decent man who'd farmed the property east of mine for 30 years, who'd never said a word against me when William died, but who clearly thought I'd lost my mind. What do you think, Ronald? He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I think you're holding on to something because William told you to, and I respect that. But, Rebecca, the rest of us have to be practical. We can't fight the state and win. We take what they offer and move on. William was practical. He told me to keep this land because he knew it would be valuable. William was dying. He wasn't thinking straight. The words hung between us like smoke. Ronald realized what he'd said, how it sounded, and his face went red. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. I handed him the fence stretcher. Thanks for returning this. He left quickly, and I went back to the barn, back to the work that never ended, feeding, fixing, planning, surviving. The town thought I was a stubborn widow clinging to a dead man's advice. Let them think it. In 5 years, 10 years, whenever that interchange got built, they'd see what William had seen. I just had to last that long. The highway widening finished in 1985. Route 40 became 4 lanes through Plainfield with modern shoulders, drainage, and traffic signals. The construction crew worked around my remaining 12 acres, the strip I'd fought to keep, and every day I drove past it on my way to town. I thought about William's hospital bed, his hand in mine, his voice saying, "Keep the frontage, never sell the ground." The interchange approval came in 1987, 2 years after the road expansion, exactly as I'd predicted. The funding followed in 1989. Construction began in 1990. And through all of it, I planted corn on those 12 acres, harvested every fall, proved to anyone watching that I could farm what I'd fought to keep. Laura called less often. David graduated from Purdue and took a job in Fort Wayne. The town stopped talking about me because widows who survive become background noise, no longer interesting enough to gossip about. And I kept farming, kept waiting, kept trusting that William had known what he was talking about when he told me the frontage was where the value lived. By 1990, when the construction crews started pouring concrete for the cloverleaf ramps, I was 56 years old. I'd survived 8 years alone. I'd outlasted the doubters, the bank, the state's assumption that a widow would fold. And I'd kept every acre William asked me to keep. The interchange sat right where he'd said it would, exactly where my 12 acres would have been if I'd sold them. The state had bought 8 acres of frontage from me at 1800 per acre. The 12 acres I kept, the 12 acres everyone thought were worthless, now sat at the northeast corner of a brand new highway interchange. The phone started ringing in 1991 before the interchange was even finished. Developers who'd driven past and seen the potential. Gas station companies, fast food chains, a hotel group from Indianapolis. Each one wanted to buy my 12 acres. Each one offered more than the last, and I said no to every single one, because William hadn't told me to sell the frontage for more money. He'd told me to keep it, to lease it, to build something that would last beyond both of us. I was about to find out if a widow could do what a dying farmer had dreamed. The first offer arrived in November 1991, 3 months before the interchange opened. A development company from Indianapolis, their letterhead embossed with gold foil that caught the overhead light in my kitchen. $120,000 for the 12 acres, $10,000 per acre. I read the letter twice, calculated the numbers in my head. The state had tried to take this land for $7,200 9 years ago. Now someone wanted to pay 17 times that amount. I wrote back, declining. The second offer came in February 1992. A gas station chain. Their proposal slick with photographs of successful locations. Revenue projections. Demographic studies proving my corner would generate millions in annual traffic. 150,000. I filed it in the drawer with the first rejection. By April, when the interchange officially opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, I didn't attend the offers, hit 180,000. I watched from my porch as cars streamed up and down the new ramps, every vehicle that entered or exited passing directly by my frontage. The visibility was perfect. The access was unmatched. And everyone who understood commercial real estate could see what I owned. Laura drove down from Carmel in May, her sedan clean and new, her clothes the kind professional women wore to parent-teacher conferences. She sat at my kitchen table, looking at the stack of offers I'd received, her hands shuffling through them like playing cards. Her voice came out careful, measured. "Mom, this one's for $220,000. That's almost $20,000 per acre." "I know what it is." "You could retire, travel, stop working dawn to dark at 58 years old." She looked up at me. "You could finally rest." I poured coffee, the percolator hissing on the stove. "Your father didn't tell me to sell for more money. He told me not to sell at all." "Dad's been gone 11 years. You've proven you can keep the farm. You've proven everyone wrong. But, Mom, $220,000, that's a fortune." "It's not enough." She set the papers down, frustration bleeding through her careful tone. "How much is enough? What number would make you say yes?" I sat across from her, wrapped my hands around the coffee mug for warmth even though the May morning wasn't cold. "Laura, do you remember Sandra Clark?" "Who?" "The woman at the Shell station on I-465. I told you about her father, how he leased his land instead of selling." Laura's face shifted, memory clicking into place. "The man who turned down $50,000 to lease for $8,000 a year. That $8,000 is worth $25,000 now. And in 2000, when his lease expires, he can renegotiate at current market rates, probably triple what he's getting. Or take back land with a gas station built on it at someone else's expense." I held Laura's eyes. Sandra's father got smart once 30 years ago. That one decision set up his whole family forever. This is my one chance to get smart. But leasing means dealing with tenants, negotiations, maintenance issues. Leasing means income that doesn't stop. Your father understood that. He made me promise. Laura stood up, walked to the window that looked out over the farmland. William and I had worked for 25 years together, that I'd worked alone for 11 years since. When she turned back, her expression had shifted into something I couldn't quite read. "You're going to lease it, aren't you?" "You already decided." "I decided 11 years ago. I've just been waiting for everyone else to catch up." She left before lunch, and I knew she'd call David. Knew they'd talk about their stubborn mother, who turned down life-changing money because a dying man had asked her to. Let them talk. William had seen this coming when Indianapolis was just starting to sprawl west, when Route 40 was still 2 lanes, when the idea of an interchange at County Road 200 South existed only in transportation planning documents. He'd seen it, and he'd trusted me to see it through. I wasn't going to let him down for the convenience of cash. The bank came for me in July. James Thompson's secretary called, asked if I could come in that afternoon for a brief discussion about your accounts. The words landed with false politeness, the kind that promised trouble dressed in professional courtesy. I walked into First National at 2 o'clock, took the chair across from Thompson's desk, and watched him arrange papers with theatrical precision. His suit was darker than it had been in our last meeting, his smile thinner. "Mrs. Anderson, I'll be direct. Several farmers in the county are experiencing financial difficulties. Interest rates remain high, commodity prices remain low, and we're seeing significant stress on agricultural operations." He paused, let the words settle. "I've been reviewing your file, and I noticed something concerning." My hand stayed folded in my lap, my face neutral. "What did you notice?" "Your late husband took out a small operating loan in 1979. According to our records, there's some ambiguity about whether it was fully satisfied." The lie came smooth and practiced, and I saw exactly what he was doing. Create doubt about an old loan. Use it to force a conversation about collateral, pressure me into either paying off phantom debt or providing security against future borrowing. Either way, the bank got leverage over my property. William paid that loan in full in 1980. I have the discharge papers. Thompson's smile never wavered. "I'm sure there's documentation somewhere. But given the ambiguity, and given that your 12-acre frontage parcel has become quite valuable, we need to clarify our position. If the loan remains outstanding, we'd need to formalize the collateral arrangement. For your protection, of course." "Of course." I leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting the bank has a lien on my property?" "I'm suggesting we need to review the paperwork. And while we're reviewing, I should mention that several developers have approached the bank about financing purchases in this area. Very motivated buyers. If you were interested in selling, we could facilitate a transaction that would clear up any questions about historical debts." There it was. The bank wanted me to sell so they could finance the buyer's purchase, earning fees on both ends, while I got pushed out of the most valuable position I'd ever own. "I'm not selling." "Mrs. Anderson, I'm trying to help you avoid complications. If our legal department determines there's an outstanding obligation—" I stood up. If your legal department has questions, they can contact my attorney, Kathleen Wright. I'm sure she'd be delighted to review your records." I walked out before he could respond, my heart hammering my hands, shaking once I reached my truck. This was different from the state's condemnation attempt. The state had been honest about wanting my land. Thompson was trying to fabricate a crisis, create pressure through manufactured uncertainty. It was cleaner than outright theft, harder to prove, designed to work on someone who didn't have the money or courage to fight back. He'd miscalculated. Kathleen's office sat above a dry cleaner on Main Street in Plainfield, 3 rooms with mismatched furniture and file boxes stacked along every wall. She'd built her practice representing people who couldn't afford the fancy firms in Indianapolis, winning often enough that the fancy firms had learned to take her seriously. When I explained what Thompson had tried, her laugh came sharp and dangerous. "He's claiming a phantom lien. That's fraud. Actual prosecutable fraud." She pulled out a legal pad, started writing in her fast, angular script. "Do you have the discharge papers?" "At home. William kept every financial record from the day we married." "Get them to me by tomorrow." I'll draft a letter to Thompson's legal department, copy the state banking commissioner, make it very clear that attempting to cloud title on your property based on fabricated debt is grounds for investigation and sanction." She looked up, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Rebecca, he just made a mistake. He thought you'd fold. He's about to learn otherwise." The letter went out 3 days later. Thompson called me the following week, his voice stripped of its earlier smoothness. "Mrs. Anderson, there seems to have been an error in our records. The 1979 loan was indeed satisfied. I apologize for any confusion. I'll need that in writing." "Of course, and I hope this won't affect your relationship with First National. We value your business." I hung up without responding. The bank valued my business the way a wolf values sheep, as something to be managed, controlled, and eventually consumed. They'd tried to intimidate me into selling, tried to use legal complexity as a weapon against a widow who wasn't supposed to have a lawyer sharp enough to see through it. But I had Kathleen, and I had the discharge papers William had kept in a manila folder labeled "Paid in Full," his handwriting neat and final. And I had the memory of him lying in that hospital bed, making me promise to never let them take the frontage. The developers kept calling through summer and into fall. Each offer climbed higher than the last, 230,000, 250,000, 270. By September 1992, a hotel group offered $285,000 for the full 12 acres. $23,000 per acre for land the state had valued at $600. David drove down from Fort Wayne for my 59th birthday in October, brought his girlfriend Sarah, a quiet woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales, and looked at my farm like it was a museum exhibit from another era. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, pot roast and potatoes, the meal I'd been making for birthday dinners since David was 5. Sarah asked the question David had probably coached her to ask. "Mrs. Anderson, have you thought about what you'll do with the farm as you get older?" "Keep farming it." "I just mean it's a lot of work for one person. David mentioned you've had some very good offers for part of the property." I looked at my son, saw him looking anywhere but at me. "David mentioned that, did he?" He cleared his throat. "Mom, Sarah, and I have been talking about getting married. We'd like to buy a house, start a family. If you sold just the frontage, you'd have enough to help us with a down payment and still keep the rest of the farm." The request landed like cold water, not because it was unreasonable, but because it revealed how far he'd drifted from understanding what this was about. He saw the frontage as 12 acres of corn. Nobody needed a cash asset I was hoarding out of stubbornness. He didn't see what William had seen, what I'd spent 11 years protecting. I'm not selling. Mom, it's $285,000. You could help your children and still have money left over. I could, or I could keep land that will be worth millions and pass that to my children instead of cash they'll spend on a house. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. David's face went tight. You really think 12 acres of frontage will be worth millions, Ma? Mom, that's not realistic. You're not some real estate developer. You're a farmer. The words cut deeper than he'd intended. I could see that in his face the moment they landed. I'm not some real estate developer, just a farmer, just a widow, just a woman who didn't understand the sophisticated world of commercial development. I stood up, started clearing plates. You should both head back before it gets too late. They left within 20 minutes, and I stood at the kitchen window watching taillights disappear down the driveway. Laura wanted me to rest. David wanted me to help him buy a house. Neither of them understood that what I was doing was bigger than any of us, that William's deathbed instructions weren't about corn or cash, but about building something that would outlast all the people who'd underestimated us. I called Kathleen the next morning. If I wanted to lease the frontage instead of sell it, how would that work? Silence on the line. Then her voice came back with a smile I could hear through the telephone. Rebecca Anderson, you beautiful, stubborn woman, tell me what you're thinking. I told her about Heinrich Müller, about Sandra Clark's father, about William's last word. I told her I wanted to structure a ground lease that would generate income forever while I kept ownership of the land. 30 years, maybe longer, with rent that escalated annually. The developers could build whatever they wanted at their expense, and when the lease expired, I'd own the land and the improvements. Kathleen made notes, asked questions, calculated numbers. This could work. Commercial ground leases are standard in real estate. You'd need the right tenant, someone creditworthy, who won't default 5 years in. And you'd need terms that protect your interests while giving them enough freedom to develop profitably. Can you draft something? I can draft a proposal that'll make any legitimate developer seriously consider leasing over buying. But Rebecca, ground leases are complex. Negotiations will take months. And once you commit to a tenant, you're in business with them for 3 decades. Choose wrong, and you'll regret it until 2023. Then help me choose right. We spent the rest of 1992 and into early 1993 crafting the lease structure, 30-year term on 9 of the 12 acres, keeping 3 as a buffer between the commercial development and my remaining farmland. Annual rent of $36,000, $4,000 per acre, with 3% escalation every year. The tenant would pay all development costs, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. At lease end, the improvements became mine. Kathleen sent the proposal to 3 development companies that had approached me earlier. 2 declined immediately. They wanted to outright own the asset, control the appreciation. The 3rd company, Midwest Commercial Development out of Indianapolis, called her back within a week. The principal was a man named Richard Davis, 50-something, who'd built strip malls and shopping centers across Indiana for 30 years. He drove to the farm in March 1993, walked the frontage with me, asked smart questions about zoning, utilities, traffic counts, and development restrictions. His voice carried the flat pragmatism of someone who'd negotiated 1,000 deals and won most of them. Mrs. Anderson, your lease proposal is expensive. 4,000 per acre annually is more than most landowners in this area could command. Most landowners don't sit at the corner of a new highway interchange. He smiled. True, but buying outright means we control timing development choices exit strategy. Leasing means we're committed to your land for 30 years, regardless of market changes. Leasing means you pay less upfront, spread the cost over time, and keep your capital free for construction. You build a gas station and convenience store here, maybe a fast food restaurant. Total investment around $800,000. You'll do $3 million in revenue the first year. My rent is 1% of your gross. That's nothing. Richard Davis looked at me for a long moment, reassessing. You've done your homework. My husband taught me to understand what I own. We negotiated for 6 weeks. He wanted 25 years. I held firm at 30. He wanted 2% annual escalation. I held at 3. He wanted an option to purchase at year 15. I refused. No purchase clause. The land stayed mine. He pushed back on maintenance obligations, zoning change costs, environmental assessments. Kathleen pushed back harder, protecting my interests while leaving him enough latitude to actually develop profitably. We signed the lease in August 1993. 30 years, 9 acres, $36,000 annually with 3% escalation. All improvements reverting to me in 2023. Midwest Commercial Development would build the structures. I'd collect rent, and at the end, I'd own prime commercial real estate worth exponentially more than the income I'd already collected. Laura came to the signing at Kathleen's office, watched me put my name on a document that would define the next 3 decades of my financial life. Afterward, in the parking lot, she grabbed my hand. Mom, you did it. You actually did it. Her voice cracked. $36,000 a year. That's more than you make farming the whole 240 acres. It's more than your father and I ever made together. I squeezed back. William was right. The frontage is where the value lives. Construction started in September. Foundation work, utility connections, a gas station, and convenience store taking shape on land I'd fought for, bled for, stood alone for. The first rent payment came in November, $3,000, the prorated amount for the partial month. I deposited it at First National, where James Thompson couldn't quite meet my eyes when I walked through his lobby. The interchange turned my 12 acres from farmland into revenue property. But the farm crisis that had been building since 1983 turned the surrounding county into an auction block. 6 farms went into foreclosure between 1983 and 1987, interest rates and falling commodity prices crushing operations that had survived for generations. I watched neighbors I'd known for 30 years lose everything, watched families pack up and move to town or out of state, watched the land that had defined them get sold to the highest bidder. Ronald Martinez, who farmed east of me, called in January 1986. His voice sounded hollow, scraped raw by defeat. Rebecca, we're selling. Bank's taking it. 80 acres, including the section that borders your east fence. Auctions in March. Ronald, I'm sorry. Don't be. We fought as long as we could. Sometimes fighting isn't enough. He paused, breathing hard. You beat the state, beat the bank, beat everyone who said a widow couldn't hold on. Maybe you got something the rest of us don't. Or maybe you're just luckier. I wasn't luckier. I was debt-free. William and I had operated on cash for 25 years together, and I'd maintained that discipline alone for the 5 years since. No equipment loans, no operating credit, no mortgage to service. When corn prices fell below cost of production, I planted less, worked harder, made do with what I had. The Farmall 560 was 33 years old. In 1986, a museum piece held together with replacement parts and mechanical knowledge William had passed down. But it was paid for, and paid for equipment meant I could survive prices that destroyed everyone who'd financed their operations. The auction came on a cold March morning, wind cutting across the empty fields like the county itself was grieving. I stood in the back of the crowd, 40 men in work coats and farm caps, watching 80 acres of good Indiana farmland go up for bids. The auctioneer worked through his practiced patter, calling for opening offers, working the crowd's hesitation into movement. Bidding started at $300 per acre, $24,000 for the whole 80. Men shifted, muttered, a few hands went up. The price climbed slowly, $320, $340, $360. I watched Timothy Henderson bid $380, watched him drop out when someone else went to $400. At $320 per acre, I raised my hand. The crowd turned. Men looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. A woman bidding at a farm auction, a widow trying to buy land when everyone knew women didn't understand agriculture finance. The whispers started immediately, a buzz of surprise and skepticism. The auctioneer's voice carried over the murmurs. I have $320, looking for $340. Someone bid $340. I went to $360. He dropped out. The auctioneer called it twice, hammered down. 80 acres at $320 per acre, total cost $25,600. The crowd parted as I walked forward to sign the paperwork, men staring like I'd performed black magic. Timothy Henderson caught my arm on the way to my truck. His face carried confusion and something that might have been respect. Rebecca, you just bought 80 acres at Depression prices. Where'd you get that kind of cash? I saved it. While fighting legal battles with the state, while running 240 acres alone, you saved $25,000. William taught me to keep reserves and to buy when everyone else is afraid. He shook his head slowly. People at the diner said you'd lose the farm within a year of William dying. Now you're buying more land, while the rest of us are barely holding on. I pulled my arm free, gentle but firm. I'm holding on because I don't carry debt. The land is mine. The equipment is mine. The only obligation I have is to keep working. I drove home with the deed to 80 additional acres farmland, purchased at prices so low they felt criminal distress sales that would be spoken about for decades as the bottom of the market. 2 years later, in 1988, another 40 acres came up for auction, the old Martin place that ran along my southern boundary. Same story, same bank, foreclosure, same desperate sale. I bought it for $380 per acre, $15,200 from the savings account that William had insisted we maintain, that I'd grown through discipline and luck, and the kind of caution that looks like cowardice until it becomes survival. My farm grew from 240 acres to 360, all paid for, all mine. And with the ground lease generating $36,000 annually from the commercial frontage, my combined income exceeded anything William and I had ever earned together. $60,000 a year in Hendricks County in 1993 put me firmly in the middle class, comfortable but not wealthy, secure in ways that felt revolutionary after 30 years of agricultural uncertainty. Timothy Henderson came to the farm in January 1996, drove up the lane, without calling ahead, found me in the machine shed welding a broken hayrake. He stood in the doorway watching me work, waiting until I finished the seam and pulled off my helmet. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you." I set the helmet down, wiped sweat from my forehead despite the January cold. "About what?" "About how you knew." He stepped inside, hands in his coat pockets. 11 years ago, you fought the state over 12 acres. Everyone said you should sell. You spent $8,000 on lawyers. People at the diner laughed at you. I laughed at you. I remember. You were right. Those 12 acres are generating $40,000 a year in rent now. You still own them. You'll own them for another 27 years, then you'll own whatever's built on them. His voice dropped. How did you know? I leaned against the workbench, studying this man who'd sold me farm equipment for 30 years, who'd dismissed me as a stubborn widow, who'd underestimated me like everyone else. My husband told me before he died, keep the frontage, never sell the ground. He learned it from his father, who learned it from a German immigrant who understood that land appreciates while buildings depreciate. I just listened. Most people don't listen. They take the quick money. William was dying. When someone you love tells you their last important thought, you don't ignore it because it's inconvenient. Timothy walked to the workbench, ran his hand along the edge like he was testing its solidity. My implement dealership is struggling. John Deere wants me to expand, build a new showroom, add service bays. They want me to borrow $200,000 and build on land I'm leasing from someone else. I'm 62, Rebecca. I don't know if I want that kind of debt this late. Then don't take it. But without expanding, they'll pull the dealership. Give it to someone who will invest. He looked up at me. What would you do? The question hung in the cold air, genuine and frightened. I thought about William sitting at our kitchen table, working through farm finances, his pencil moving carefully through columns of numbers, his philosophy, simple and unchanging, own what matters, avoid debt that doesn't build equity, never bet the farm on someone else's timeline. Find land you can buy, even if it means a smaller showroom, a different location. Build something you own completely on ground that's yours. Because John Deere doesn't care if you succeed or fail, they care about their expansion strategy. But if you own the land and the building, you control your future. Timothy nodded slowly, absorbing this. You learned this from William. I learned this from living it, from watching my husband die and realizing that the only things that matter are the things you truly own: your land, your integrity, your promises. He left without saying anything else, drove away in his dealership pickup with the John Deere logo on the door. 6 months later, I heard he'd closed the Plainfield location and reopened outside Brownsburg on 5 acres he'd bought with cash. Smaller operation, but wholly his. He sent me a card thanking me for the advice, telling me he slept better, knowing the bank couldn't take what he'd built. I kept that card in my desk drawer, a small piece of evidence that maybe the widow everyone had doubted knew something worth knowing. The interchange traffic grew steadily through the mid-90s. Cars flowed on and off the ramps every day, every hour, a constant stream of potential customers for the gas station and convenience store sitting on my ground lease. Midwest Commercial Development's investment was paying off exactly as Richard Davis had projected, and my rent checks arrived like clockwork on the first of every month. $42,000 by 1996, $44,000 by 1997. The 3% annual escalation compounded, quietly building wealth I could see in my bank statements, but barely believed belonged to me. Then, in May 1998, 16 years after the state first tried to take my frontage, the Indiana Department of Transportation needed a sliver of what remained. A 30-foot easement for a right turn lane into the commercial development, facilitating traffic flow that everyone acknowledged had exceeded projections. Standard procedure for a growing interchange, a minor taking that most landowners would barely notice. But I noticed, and so did Christopher Lewis. He was 28, fresh out of INDOT's training program, assigned to handle right-of-way acquisitions in the district. He drove up in a state vehicle on a Tuesday morning, walked to where I was repainting the barn door, introduced himself with the nervous confidence of someone who'd never faced a property owner who understood what they were negotiating. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm Christopher Lewis with INDOT. We need a small easement for roadwork adjacent to your commercial parcel, .4 acres, 30-foot width for a turn lane. Standard compensation is $13,000 per acre. Total offer is $5,200. I set down my paintbrush, looked at this young man who had no idea what had happened on this property in 1982, who thought this was routine. $13,000 an acre. Yes, ma'am. Current fair market value for commercial frontage in this corridor. In 1982, your department offered me $600 per acre for the same frontage." His face shifted confusion, then dawning awareness that this wasn't routine after all. He pulled out a tablet, computer, started typing, pulled up property records. I watched him read through the condemnation case file, watched him understand what he'd walked into. His voice came quieter when he looked back up. "You fought the department. You won." "I fought the appraisal. The court agreed your department was paying a third of fair value. And you kept the 12 acres, the ones that—" He gestured toward the gas station, the convenience store, the commercial development that generated more traffic than anyone had predicted. The ones worth 40-some thousand a year in ground rent. The interchange that's now the reason my land is worth $13,000 per acre instead of $600. Understanding settled over Christopher Lewis's face like weather. He looked at me, really looked, seeing not just a 64-year-old farmer in work clothes, but a woman who'd outmaneuvered the state, who'd bet everything on being right, who'd won bigger than anyone in the department had predicted. "Ma'am, I'll prepare the easement paperwork. $5,200 at $13,000 per acre. And I'll tell my supervisor the story about the widow who knew more about land value than our entire appraisal division." I accepted the check 3 weeks later, deposited it at First National, where James Thompson had long since stopped trying to pressure me into anything. The turn lane made access easier, improved traffic flow, increased the commercial value of my ground lease. INDOT had taken .4 acres and inadvertently made my remaining acreage more valuable. William would have appreciated the irony. Laura brought Emily to the farm in October 2001. My granddaughter was 8 years old, curious and bright, asking questions faster than anyone could answer them. We sat on the front porch watching the interchange traffic, and Emily kept trying to count the cars until the numbers overwhelmed her. "Grandma, why do all those cars go past your farm?" "Because the state built a highway here, and highways bring people." "Did you build the gas station?" Laura answered before I could. "No, honey. Someone else built it on Grandma's land. They pay her to use it." Emily's forehead wrinkled. "They pay you just for using your land. Every month. And when the lease ends in 22 years, I'll own the gas station too." "But you didn't build it." "I didn't have to. I just had to own the land and be patient." I looked at Laura. "Your mom thought I was making a mistake. Lots of people did." Laura's voice carried something I hadn't heard before, pride mixed with apology. "I was wrong, Mom. When you turned down $250,000 in 1993, I thought you'd lost your mind. Now you've made almost that much in rent, and you still own everything." Emily climbed into my lap, surprisingly heavy for 8 years old, warm and solid. "Grandma, were people mean to you?" The question caught me sideways. I thought about James Thompson trying to fabricate debt, about the men at Ronald Martinez's auction staring at me like I didn't belong, about Timothy Henderson laughing at my legal battles in the diner, about my own children begging me to take the safe money and quit fighting. Some people were mean. Most people just thought I was wrong. Being a woman trying to run a farm made them think I didn't understand. Being a widow made them think I was acting out of grief instead of strategy. But you were right. I was right because I listened to your grandfather, and because I refused to let anyone tell me I didn't understand my own land. Laura wiped her eyes, not quite crying, but close. "Mom, I need to tell you something. All those years when I pushed you to sell, when I said you should rest, or help David buy a house, or just take the money, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was scared. Scared you'd work yourself to death. Scared the bank would take the farm. Scared everyone was right and you were wrong. I know. But you weren't wrong. You were building something none of us could see yet. And now Emily gets to learn from you what I was too afraid to learn." I held my granddaughter and felt the weight of William's death of 16 years, fighting alone of every person who'd underestimated me because I was female and widowed and supposedly too emotional to understand real estate. I'd carried that weight long enough that it had become part of my structure, invisible, until someone acknowledged it. "Emily, your grandfather told me something before he died. He said, 'The man who sells the land gets money once. The man who leases the land gets money forever.' Do you understand what that means?" She shook her head against my shoulder. "It means you don't sell the things that grow in value. You keep them. You build on them. You pass them to people you love." I kissed the top of her head. "And when you're grown, this farm will still be here, still generating income, still owned by our family, because I kept my promise to the man who taught me that the ground is more valuable than anything built on it." The sun set over the interchange, casting long shadows across the commercial development that would eventually become mine, across the farmland I'd expanded through foreclosure sales, across the machinery shed where William's old Farmall 560 sat waiting for another spring. I'd started with a widow's grief and a dead man's instructions. I'd built it into an income stream that would outlast everyone who doubted me. And I still owned every acre. The doctor's office in April 2003 smelled like antiseptic and bad news. I sat on the examination table paper crinkling under me while Dr. Patricia Miller reviewed my test results with the careful neutrality physicians use when they don't want to alarm you but need you to listen. Rebecca, your heart is showing signs of strain. Nothing immediately dangerous, but at 69, after decades of physical labor, your cardiovascular system is telling you to slow down. How much slower? No more 12-hour days on the tractor, no heavy lifting. You need to consider reducing your workload significantly, or you're looking at serious complications within a few years. I drove home through spring fields turning green with new corn, past the interchange that had defined the last 2 decades of my life, past the commercial development generating $53,000 in annual rent. My body was giving out. The farm still needed working, and I had no plan for what came next. Laura called that evening before I could call her. Mothers and daughters develop psychic connections through worry, and apparently mine was broadcasting distress. "Mom, you sound strange. What's wrong?" I told her about the appointment, about Dr. Miller's warnings, about the reality that I couldn't farm 360 acres alone anymore. Maybe I'd never really been able to, just too stubborn to admit it. "David and I want to come down this weekend. We need to talk about the future." They arrived Saturday morning, Laura at 50, David at 42, both successful in careers that had nothing to do with agriculture, both carrying the guilt of children who'd left their parent to work alone. We sat at the kitchen table where every important conversation in this house had happened, where William had died in my memory every day for 22 years. Laura spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent 25 years managing classrooms full of children. "Mom, you can't keep doing this alone, and you shouldn't have to. I'm not selling. Nobody's asking you to sell. But you need help managing 360 acres plus the commercial lease. David and I want to be involved. We want to learn what you know before it's too late." David leaned forward, his engineer's mind already working through logistics. "I can work remotely 2 days a week. Sarah's supportive, and we want Joshua to learn about the farm. He's 12, now old enough to understand what you've built." Joshua, my grandson, who I'd seen maybe twice a year, who knew me as the grandmother who lived on a farm, but not as the woman who'd fought the state and won. "You want to bring Joshua here. We want him to learn from you, the same way Emily's been learning." Laura's eyes met mine. "Mom, you did something remarkable. You proved everyone wrong, built generational wealth from stubbornness and strategy. But if you die with all that knowledge in your head, what good does it do?" The words landed hard because they were true. I'd spent 22 years protecting what William asked me to protect, but I hadn't thought about what came after I was gone. The ground lease had 20 years remaining. The farmland needed working, and I was 69 with a heart that couldn't handle the strain. "I need to hire someone to farm the land. I can't do it anymore." David nodded. "Then we'll help you find the right person. Someone who understands they're farming your land, not buying it." We spent the rest of the weekend reviewing finances, touring the property, discussing succession planning with the kind of practical detail I'd avoided for 2 decades. Laura would take primary responsibility for managing the ground lease and property taxes. David would handle equipment maintenance and hiring decisions. And I would teach them everything William had taught me about why the ground mattered more than anything built on it. Kevin Anderson came, recommended by Timothy Henderson, who'd rebuilt his implement business into something smaller but sustainable. Kevin was 32, married with 2 young children, farming on rented ground for 3 different landlords, and barely making enough to survive. He sat in my living room in May 2003, work-worn hands folded in his lap, listening to my proposal with the careful attention of someone who couldn't afford to misunderstand. I'm offering you a 10-year farm lease on 360 acres. Cash rent $120 per acre per year. You farm it however you want, crop rotation, organic, conventional, your choice. You keep all the revenue from what you grow. You pay me $43,200 every November 15th. His face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, hope. Mrs. Anderson, I can't afford to buy land. That's why I'm renting from multiple people. Are you sure you want to commit to someone like me for 10 years? I'm not offering to sell. I'm offering a stable, long-term lease to someone who'll treat my land right. Timothy says, you're honest and hardworking. That's what I need. Why me? You could rent to bigger operations for more money. Bigger operations treat land like a commodity. You treat it like it matters. There's a difference. I stood up, walked to the window overlooking fields William and I had planted together, that I'd planted alone for 22 years, that I could no longer physically manage. My husband died telling me to keep this ground. I've kept it. Now I need to make sure it's cared for by someone who understands that farming isn't just about yield per acre. Kevin signed the lease in June, $43,200 annually from farm rent, $53,000 from the commercial ground lease, $96,000 in combined income from land I'd refused to sell when everyone told me to. I was officially retired from physical farming at 69, wealthier than I'd ever imagined, healthier than I'd be if I'd kept working myself into the ground. And for the first time since William's death, I could breathe without the weight of proving everyone wrong pressing down on my chest. Emily came for the summer in 2005, 12 years old, and burning with questions about everything. She followed me around the farm like a detective, gathering evidence, taking notes in a spiral notebook, asking why I'd made every decision that had brought me to this point. We walked the 3-acre buffer I'd kept between the commercial development and the rest of the farmland, grass growing wild where corn used to be, and Emily wanted to know why I hadn't leased all 12 acres. Because I needed separation. The commercial tenants control 9 acres, but I control what sits between their development and my farm. That buffer means they can't expand without my permission, can't encroach on land I might want to develop differently later. But you're losing money. You could be getting another $12,000 a year. I'm not losing money. I'm maintaining control. Money is renewable. You can always make more. But once you give up control of your land, you never get it back. She wrote this down, her handwriting cramped and serious. We walked to the interchange, stood on the overpass, watching traffic flow beneath us, and I explained how I'd known this would happen when the state first came with their $12,000 offer. Everyone thought I was wrong because I was a widow, because women weren't supposed to understand commercial real estate or long-term strategy. They thought I was emotional, clinging to what my husband said because I couldn't accept he was gone. Emily looked up at me, her face fierce. But you weren't emotional. You were right. I was both. I was emotional about keeping William's promise, and I was right about the land value. People assume emotion and intelligence can't coexist in the same decision. They're wrong. She spent the rest of summer helping Laura manage the ground lease paperwork, learning about escalation clauses and maintenance obligations and property tax assessments. By August, when she went back to school, she could explain the difference between a ground lease and a land sale better than most real estate agents. More importantly, she understood why the difference mattered. Laura called me in September after Emily's first week back. "Mom," Emily told her economics teacher about your ground lease. "The teacher didn't believe a farmer could structure a deal that sophisticated. Emily brought in your lease documents to prove it." "What did the teacher say?" "She said Emily's grandmother was smarter than most commercial developers. And then she asked if you'd come speak to the class about real estate investment." I declined the speaking invitation, but felt something shift in my chest. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction that my granddaughter understood what I'd built, that she could articulate it to people who assumed farmers were simple. William had seen the value in the frontage 24 years ago. I'd protected it for 22 years. Now Emily was learning to see what we'd seen, and the knowledge wouldn't die when I did. The 20-year mark on the commercial ground lease came in 2013, triggering the renegotiation clause we'd written into the original agreement. Richard Davis, now 72 and semi-retired from Midwest commercial development, drove to the farm in October to discuss new terms. We sat on the porch where I'd sat with William countless evenings, where I'd made every major decision since his death, where the view now included a thriving gas station and convenience store that had generated over $1 million in rent since 1993. Richard's opening offer was $60,000 annually for another 20 years. Fair, reasonable, substantially higher than current rates. I told him no. "Rebecca, $60,000 is generous. The market's softer than it was in the 90s. I'm offering you above market rates out of respect for our relationship. Richard, your gas station does $4 million in annual revenue. Your convenience store does another $2 million. You're grossing $6 million a year on my land. And you want to pay me 1% of that. I want $65,000 with 3% annual escalation, same as before." We negotiated for 3 weeks. He pushed back on maintenance costs, on competition from newer developments, on economic uncertainty. Kathleen Wright, now 73, and still my attorney pushed back harder. We settled at $62,000 annually, 3% escalation, 20-year term running through 2033. The lease would expire when I was 99 years old, if I lived that long, and Emily would be 40 by then, old enough to renegotiate again or take possession of improvements worth millions. Laura witnessed the signing Emily beside her 3 generations of Anderson women in Kathleen's office, watching me commit to another 20 years of rental income that would compound into generational wealth. The first payment under the new terms arrived in December 2013, $5,100 for the partial month. I deposited it and watched my account balance climb past numbers William and I had never imagined possible. That night, alone in the farmhouse that had held 58 years of my life, I spoke to William the way I sometimes still did when decisions felt too big to hold alone. "We did it! The frontage is worth more than the whole farm, just like you said it would be." The silence answered back, with the weight of 2 decades fighting for something nobody else believed in. But I'd kept my promise, and the ground stayed mine. Timothy Henderson came to the farm for the last time in March 2012, driving slowly up the lane, like a man visiting a memorial. He was 78, fully retired, his son having sold the John Deere dealership 5 years earlier to a regional chain. We sat on the porch in unseasonably warm weather, drinking coffee, watching the interchange traffic that had become background noise to my life. Rebecca, I've been thinking about the first time I met you after William died. You came into the dealership to buy parts for that old Farmhouse, and I offered to send a mechanic to help you install them. You said no. I remember. You thought I couldn't do it myself. I thought you needed protection. That's what we all thought. You needed men to protect you from the world, from bad decisions, from your own grief. He set his coffee cup down, hands shaking slightly with age. We were so wrong, it's embarrassing. You weren't wrong about grief. I was drowning in it. But grief didn't make me stupid. It made me desperate to keep the promise I'd made. The promise kept you alive. I realize that now. His voice went soft, confessor quiet. My wife died in 2008. Cancer. She made me promise to sell the dealership, said watching me work myself to death for John Deere's expansion goals was killing her as much as the disease. I didn't listen, kept the dealership another 3 years until my son finally forced me out. I'm sorry about your wife? Don't be sorry. Be proud you listened when someone who loved you told you what mattered. I sold my dealership to strangers who gutted it and closed it within 5 years. You kept your land, and it's worth more every year. The difference between us is you knew when to listen. I thought about William in that hospital bed, his hand in mine, his breathing shallow and desperate, using his last coherent moments to tell me what he'd learned from his father, what his father had learned from Heinrich Müller. Information traveling across generations because someone cared enough to listen and someone else cared enough to remember. Timothy William told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "The man who sells the land gets money once, but the man who leases the land gets money forever." That wasn't just real estate advice. It was life advice. Keep what matters. Build on it. Pass it down. I wish I'd understood that 40 years ago. You understand it now. That counts for something. He left shortly after, and I watched his truck disappear down the lane. Another person from William's generation fading away, leaving me as the last witness to how this all started. I was 78 years old. My heart was stable but fragile. The ground lease had 21 years remaining, and I needed to make sure Emily understood everything before I couldn't teach her anymore. The teaching accelerated through the 2010s. Emily graduated from Purdue in 2015 with a degree in real estate development and land management, came back to Hendricks County instead of taking offers from Indianapolis firms, started working for a property management company while learning the family business from Laura. She married a quiet engineer named Scott in 2017, had their daughter Anna in 2019, and brought the baby to the farm every weekend, like she was introducing a new generation to the land that had defined ours. I was 85 when Anna was born, old enough to understand that this might be my last chance to see a grandchild grow up. I held her in my arms that first visit, this tiny creature who shared my blood and my history, but who knew nothing about the battles that had built her inheritance, and I made her the same promise I'd made William. I will protect what's ours. I will keep the ground. Laura, 67, and retired from teaching, had taken over daily management of both leases. She handled communications with Richard Davis's successor at Midwest Commercial Development, negotiated with Kevin Anderson about crop damage and fence repairs, paid property taxes and insurance from the rental income that now exceeded 100,000 annually. She'd become what I'd been for 22 years, the guardian of Anderson family land, the keeper of promises made by dead men to living women. David visited less frequently his life in Fort Wayne, absorbing time that farming once would have demanded. But Joshua, now 28 and working in agricultural finance, started asking questions about the ground lease structure, about long-term land value appreciation, about strategies for preserving family wealth across generations. He'd grown up hearing stories about his grandmother who fought the state and won, but now he wanted to understand the mechanics of how I'd won. We sat in my kitchen in November 2020, three generations present, me at 86, Laura at 68, Emily at 27, with baby Anna asleep in a carrier. Joshua spread financial documents across the table William and I had eaten at for 25 years together, that I'd eaten at alone for 39 years since his death. Grandma, the commercial lease, generates $68,000 this year. Kevin's farm lease brings $43,000. Combined annual income of $111,000 from land you refused to sell for $12,000 in 1982. That's a 900% increase in offered value, and you're still collecting income while owning the asset. The math was always simple. Keep what appreciates lease, what generates income, never give up the ground. Joshua looked at Emily, something passing between them I couldn't quite read. Emily spoke, her voice carrying Laura's practical tone. Grandma, we want to learn how to do what you did. Not copy it, the world's different now, but understand the principles well enough to build something similar. Anna woke up crying, and Emily lifted her from the carrier, rocked her gently while continuing to talk. This baby will grow up with resources we never had. She'll go to college without debt. She'll inherit land worth millions, all because you fought for 12 acres in 1982 when everyone said you were wrong. The weight of those words settled over me like November frost. I'd spent 38 years protecting William's vision, building something that would outlast both of us, proving that a widow could understand land value better than state appraisers and bank officers, and every man who'd assumed grief made women stupid. Now I was watching my family understand what I'd built, watching them prepare to carry it forward. Emily, bring Anna to the farm every weekend. Let her crawl in the dirt. Let her watch the interchange traffic. When she's old enough to understand, teach her what I'm teaching you. Never sell the ground. Build on it. Pass it down. I will, Grandma. I promise. Promises across generations. William to me to Emily, Emily to Anna. The ground lease as both income stream and inheritance, physical land and financial legacy, dirt you could touch and wealth you could measure. It was everything William had dreamed about in that hospital bed. Everything he'd asked me to protect manifested in 3 generations of women who understood that the real value wasn't in what you sold, but in what you kept. I died in my sleep on November 12, 2023, 2 weeks before my 89th birthday. Heart failure, peaceful Dr. Miller's predictions finally catching up with me. Laura found me in the morning, still in bed, looking, she told Emily later, like I'd just fallen asleep mid-thought and decided not to wake up. The funeral drew 200 people to the Plainfield Methodist Church, a building I'd attended irregularly for 60 years, where William and I had been married in 1957, where we'd baptized Laura and David. The newspaper obituary called me a pioneering woman farmer, a shrewd businesswoman, a beloved mother and grandmother. They mentioned the fight with INDOT, the ground lease, the expansion of the farm through foreclosure purchases. They made it sound inevitable, like success had been obvious from the start. But I'd lived through the uncertainty. I'd felt the pressure from the bank, the mockery from the diner, the doubt from my own children. I'd spent 22 years alone, wondering if William had been right, if I was strong enough to prove it, if the frontage would ever actually generate the value he'd promised. The obituary smoothed over the terror and made it look like strategy. But strategy is just terror you survived long enough to call wisdom. Emily spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite tears. She told stories about summer visits, about learning to see land, value in interchange, traffic, about a grandmother who taught her that being underestimated was an advantage if you were patient enough to wait for proof. Laura cried quietly in the front pew, holding David's hand, surrounded by grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about the widow who fought the state. Kathleen Wright, 93, and walking with a cane, sat near the back. The only other person in that church who understood exactly how close the fight had come to breaking me. The ground lease had 10 years remaining. Kevin Anderson's farm lease had been renewed twice and would run another 7 years. The commercial development sat on 9 acres, generating $71,000 annually, and in 2033, when the lease expired, whoever owned my land would take possession of buildings worth $8 million. I'd turned down $12,000 and built it into an income stream that would exceed $3 million over the lease's lifetime. The frontage William told me to keep had generated more wealth than the entire farm produced in 50 years of cultivation, and I'd kept my promise until the day my heart finally gave out. Emily and Laura handled the estate. David managed the funeral logistics. And 3 days after we buried me next to William in Fairview Cemetery, they gathered at the farmhouse to review succession plans I'd made with Kathleen 5 years earlier. Everything went to Laura with explicit instructions that Emily would inherit at Laura's death and Anna at Emily's death. The ground stayed in Anderson family ownership forever, or as close to forever as legal documents could enforce. No sales allowed without unanimous consent of all living descendants. The farm could be leased, developed, improved, but never sold. William's words written into binding legal language: never sell the ground. Emily moved into the farmhouse in January 2024 with Scott and Anna, now 5 years old and asking constant questions about the farm, about the grandmother she'd known for only 4 years, about why everyone said I was important. Laura visited weekly, helping manage the leases, teaching Emily the administrative details that ground lease income required. And on a Tuesday in March 2024, sitting at the kitchen table where 4 generations of Anderson family decisions had been made, Emily faced a choice that tested everything I'd taught her. Midwest Commercial Development's new principal, a 40-something MBA named Marcus Webb, had approached her with an offer to purchase the commercial parcel outright, $1.5 million for 9 acres, and the improvements a clean exit from landlord responsibilities, a fortune by any measure. Emily sat with the offer letter in front of her, Scott across the table, Laura on speakerphone, Anna coloring in the living room. The numbers were extraordinary, the temptation was real, and I wasn't there to tell her what to do. Scott's voice came gentle, supportive. "Em, that's enough money to pay off the farmhouse, set up Anna's college fund, invest for retirement. We'd be set for life. But we'd lose the lease income. 71,000 annually, growing 3% each year. Over 10 years, that's 790,000 plus. We'd own improvements worth 8 million when the lease expires. Laura's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Emily, your grandmother died protecting that ground lease. She turned down 10 times this offer over the years. But she also taught you to think for yourself. This is your decision. Emily looked at the offer letter, at the number that represented everything her generation valued: liquidity, flexibility, freedom from long-term obligations. Then she looked at Anna in the living room coloring with the intense focus 5-year-olds bring to important tasks, this child who would inherit whatever Emily decided today. She thought about me at 48, widowed and alone, facing $12,000 offered by the state. She thought about me at 69, retiring from physical farming but keeping the ground. She thought about me at 86, holding Anna and making promises about protecting what was ours. The frontage is where the value lives. William had said it. I'd proven it. Now Emily had to decide if that truth survived into a fourth generation. She picked up a pen, turned over the offer letter, and wrote on the blank side, in handwriting that looked startlingly like mine, "No sale. Lease only. The ground stays ours." Scott nodded slowly. Laura's voice came through the speaker with something between relief and pride. And Anna, oblivious to the decision being made, held up her drawing: a house, a barn, a road with cars, everything a 5-year-old understood about the farm that had defined her family. Emily mailed the rejection the next morning, then sat down with Kathleen Wright's successor to draft new lease terms for when the current agreement expired in 2033. She was 31 years old, managing property worth millions, raising a daughter who would someday face the same choice, carrying forward the lesson I'd learned from William, that he'd learned from his father, that his father had learned from Heinrich Müller. Sell the crop, never sell the ground. The Anderson family ground lease would generate income long after everyone reading this had died. The frontage I'd fought for in 1982 would appreciate through decades my grandchildren's grandchildren would inherit. And somewhere in that future, another woman would sit at this kitchen table facing pressure to sell, and she'd remember the widow who said no when no was the hardest word to speak. William died asking me to keep the frontage. I'd kept it for 42 years, built it into generational wealth, proved that a woman alone could outthink the state and outmaneuver the bank and outlast every person who'd bet against her. The ground was ours, the income was ours, the future was ours, and I'd kept my promise.